One of these days, I will get this stuff right when it comes to computers. Hi, everyone. I'm Weslee, and I am one of the ministers of congregational care here at Brentwood United Methodist Church. And we're so glad that you all have chosen to join us tonight for our latest edition of Resiliency and Hope. And we have kind of prepared this time basically to talk about things surrounding mental wellness, because frankly, we believe it's important for the church to do that. Over the last 5 months, if you've been with us, we've discussed things like anxiety and depression and stresses within families. We've talked about grief. We've talked about isolation. We've talked about anger. We've looked at what this last year has been. And with all of that, I hope that you who are listening or you who are watching have been able to find some strategies to kind of help deal with some of those things that you yourself might be experiencing. This month, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go from where we have been, and we're going to talk about how we pivot. I know everybody thinks of Friends episode and is it Friends? When there's like pivot, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. We're going to be friends talking about that here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we grow from our challenges. We're not going to leave everything we've talked about, but we are going to shift a little bit. I'll go ahead and say I've got about 5 pages worth of things that I've been thinking, and we're not going to deal with all of those tonight. So this might turn into one in a mini series within this resiliency and hope that we're doing. There's just so much good stuff and hard stuff and challenging stuff to talk about. So over the last couple weeks, when I've been thinking about this, there have been some really interesting encounters that I have had. People have sent me articles about this. I've had conversations with coworkers about this. I personally have spent some time kind of delving into some things that have been a little bit challenging for me. And what I have decided in the middle of a lot of this stuff is grief is just weird. We have a grieving process, and there's, this is what you go through first, and here's your second stage, and here's your third stage. But it really is a whole lot more jumbled up. So for those of you who are watching, this is what it really looks like. And if I were good with IT, I'd bring this up on my screen, but I'm not. So here you have your stages of grief, and this is what it's really like. So I don't know where you are in this jumbled mess, but that's really kind of what it's like. So what I would like to do right now also is to encourage you, if you are in whatever stage you are in, these conversations are on our page, bumsy.net/resiliency. You can go back and look at that. If you are in a place still where you are, working through some anger, or you're having a really hard time grieving, or you're feeling isolated, go back and find those particular conversations that we had. Go back, look at them. We're not leaving those. We're just kind of incorporating them and looking at them a little bit differently. But like I said, this process is messy. So you're not going to hit the same stage that somebody else is. So for those of you all who have been with us before, you know that I am joined by our 3 counselors who are with Brentwood United Methodist Church. They're in our counseling center back behind our church. And we have Dr. John Fite, we have Dr. Jim Wellborn, and we have Stacy Jagger. Dr. Fite is a counseling psychologist. He specializes in individual and couples therapy for adults, adolescents, and he does also both executive and life coaching. And we have Dr. Wellborn, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in individual, family, and group psychotherapy with children and adolescents. And we have Stacy Jagger, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in restoring the connection between children and their parents. I am always so glad that y'all are here, because frankly, y'all's expertise makes this a whole lot more interesting. So thank y'all for joining me again. As a reminder also, for those who are listening or watching live, there is an Ask a Counselor box where you can submit your questions to the counselors to answer tonight. So with that, we're going to get started. I've done a whole lot of talking, but I'm going to continue.
Well, apparently pages and pages of things to talk about on top of it. So
it's like all of this stuff, and it's good. Okay, maybe it's not real good stuff. Maybe it's just stuff
to be seen.
This is why I have y'all here.
Good. We're glad to be here.
You're glad to be here to listen to me talk.
Yeah.
Well, what I was, as I mentioned, we have spent the last 5 months talking about challenges that have been heightened by the pandemic. But honestly, if we're truthful, these aren't things that we haven't experienced before. Now, it might be a little different. They might be more heightened. They might be a little more intense. But we've really experienced a lot of these things in varying degrees up until that point. One thing that I'm noticing, vaccines are rolling out, places and events are starting to open up. It's spring, the weather's getting warmer, the days are getting longer. We just came out of the Lent season. We have celebrated Easter. Not sure about y'all, but it really feels like things are shifting, at least externally. So what I'm wondering, is there really a shift going on? And how do we make that transition to the internal shift? Tag.
Well, mine was for the last year. All of my meetings have been online, and I've been very meticulous about isolating and kind of making sure that I stayed safe in terms of exposure. And with the vaccines coming online, one of the ways that I noticed about how I seemed to be coping with things is that during that whole time, now thinking back, I just stopped thinking about all of the places I could go. And for me, it had a lot to do with restaurants because I'm a person who really likes food and likes to eat. But I stopped thinking of restaurants, okay? But I found myself like a couple of weeks ago, I was able to get vaccinated. And after I got my first vaccination, as I was driving someplace, not to a location, but to get from one place to another, I found myself noticing all the restaurants that were on the road. And so there's a way in which I clearly have started to kind of, my mind is shifting about what's possible, but it's also premature because there's still the risk that's out there and the percentage of people who are vaccinated. And so we're in this transition of sorts about where you can see the end. Before, it was really difficult to be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're seeing that now, but it's like the pull seems to be greater for me personally than it was before, when I just kind of remove things from consideration in my own mind.
I think for me, I would kind of illustrate this by two stories. Recently, I had a car worked on, and the person was, did a really good job in providing service. And at the end of it, I've been vaccinated here for a while. And so I just instinctively stuck out my hand and shook their hand. And then I said, "Oh no, use hand sanitizer." So I think this will all naturally come back. It's there, as Jim said. On the other hand, I had an old friend in the neighborhood who's from another city who stopped by to just see me out front briefly today, in there with her adult daughter who has MS. She was taking her for treatment. And I said, I went out there with a mask and I was taking it off. And I said, you guys have been vaccinated? And they said, no, we never intend to be vaccinated because we're worried about that. And her daughter had been to Nashville to get a COVID test. So it reminded me that there's going to be that continuing disparity in the way that we look at things, that's part of this. As Jim said, we're not out of the woods yet. You know, people that are living with people who are immunocompromised can still be affected in some ways. And so there's a reason to be careful. But I'm not worried about those old things coming back, you know. I'm worried more about the people who've been impacted in a more permanent way by this pandemic. And as they look at the rest of us kind of blithely going on with our lives, they may feel doubly hurt and doubly left out. I want to remember them too.
So I sat in traffic for 2 hours last night to get home, and I was thinking, well, I guess we're going back to, you know, I told my husband the best part of the pandemic has been the lack of traffic. And so here I am sitting in traffic, and I live in South Williamson, so it definitely shouldn't have taken me 2 hours to get home. But so there, I don't know, there's a little bit of sadness for me of going back to, you know, the you know, same old, what we were used to. And then there's a part of me that's very relieved that people seem to be giving a sigh of relief, that and their anxiety is coming down. I think a little bit of being able to interact with their loved ones, and there's more hugging happening. And so I think it's both and.
Mm-hmm. I love that you all have pretty much said we're all over the map with these things. Somebody might be perfectly fine with this, and then you've got the person over here who's still, you know, has been impacted in ways that this person hasn't. And there's such a gap between those, and everybody in between too. Everybody's kind of in their own space. When we talk about how we're kind of moving out and into a different place, we can't go back to where we were. So how do we make a change like this as therapists? When you have somebody who comes into your office, how do you guide I keep wanting to, for those who aren't watching and are listening, you can't see me trying to pivot over here. But how do y'all do those things? How is it something that just happens, or is it a process?
Yes, both. It just happens, and it's a process. And sometimes it's a process because it didn't just happen, because you kind of find yourself flowing into something, or the circumstances of your life, or the way in which you've come to have realizations about things, especially as we age. You gain perspective across that time, and it can then have you start becoming more aware of things that were just on autopilot, or that were just flowing in the direction that they were flowing. And so but other times there can be, like the pandemic, a crisis moment, or trauma, or things that dramatically, in a very sudden and immediate sense, impact you and change your view about what the world is like, and what's possible, and what you could rely on, and what you can expect, sometimes from yourself, sometimes from other people. So from the perspective of how that can become something that people are aware of and want to do something different about, it can be a gradual thing. It can occur from a sudden thing, but it's not like, even if it's a sudden realization, there's still a process that you have to go through about trying to figure out what you're going to do about that, and how you want things to be different.
I always like to joke and say that, you know, most therapeutic things happen outside of the therapy office, you know, and thank God that they do, because there wouldn't be enough therapists. We couldn't make enough therapists, you know, for otherwise. And so, you know, the things that I say here apply to having what I'm going to call an expert listener or an expert companion, not just a friend. Because what does that mean, whether it's a therapist or not? It means someone who knows how to be there for you during those early stages where you're just focusing on survival. And we've all kind of gone through this, you know. Think a year ago, we were all literally just focused on survival. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. But later, there comes a time, and it varies for each person, where it's useful to ask some questions, you know, among them questions like, what did you learn? You know, what's your takeaway going to be from this experience? For example, Stacy brought up about work, and many people are reconsidering work, you know, what shape they want it to take in the future. And there are just countless other things many people have learned about themselves in their relationship as a couple, you know, during this stage. And so it's important to know that to have those people in your life, you know, not just therapists, but, you know, wise people who can ask the right kind of question at the right moment. Sometimes it's too early for a question like that, but then later it can be a great benefit to kind of consider what you've learned and how you want your life to be different.
I'm always amazed at how just being a witness to someone's life and story can be so helpful, and walking people through difficult things. I love seeing people or just having the privilege of being a witness to their lives and their stories. But what ends up happening is they just kind of move through it and find solutions on their own because the answers are inside of them. And I agree with John in that it doesn't have to be a therapist. You know, I don't know how much you know, some of my own healing came from a very dear, close family friend. It wasn't a professional. And so I think it's important to know that you really can show up for people and their stories and in their lives, and not have to be in a professional position, but just being a witness it's a powerful thing, truly. And they kind of pivot on their own, really. I mean, in sitting with people, you watch them pivot and find solutions, pivoting by finding the solutions within them, if that makes sense. So
makes sense to me. So it's a lot of listening.
A lot of
listening and paraphrasing for them.
Profound listening. And I really believe that we can all do that for each other. It doesn't have to be a professional relationship, you know, like really learning how to listen well is so important. You know, I think we get lost in social media and scrolling and just to sit with somebody and turn everything off and be truly present is sometimes that's all that it takes, is like deep listening for someone to heal and pivot and find solutions and grieve and all the things that they need to do. So
I like the word present that you said, is being fully present with someone, to be able to hear. And this isn't necessary, I mean, yes, in a therapist relationship, but also just being friends with someone, encouraging that change and deep listening, which occurs when you are fully present with someone. Is there, and I hesitate to ask this question, everybody's like, oh no.
Favorite kind.
Is it ever helpful to force a pivot?
Sometimes, if you're working with young children. It's sometimes necessary a pivot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to force a pivot.
But that might be best left up to therapists to do that, huh?
Well, Stacy was clear about saying also children. Okay, there's a particular class of people, which is kids, and if you leave them to their own devices, you know, whether they will run harem scarum in various directions that don't have a kind of direction. The implicit part. So, but from the perspective of you know, the one aspect of therapy that's at its core is having to, as a therapist, maintain clarity about who is actually the source of influence for somebody changing. And it's not the therapist. If you think you're the one who's doing that to or for that person, there's a problem. The client themselves, and this is just true for people, the source of that is internal. And so therapists whose business it is to facilitate change and to be knowledgeable about ways to help people make the kind of changes that they want means that we have an active role in doing that. But that is different from where the seat of that change occurs. And that's the person themselves. And that to me is also a part of as Stacy was talking about why listening with a clear and supportive presence becomes so important, because that makes it possible for the person to have a greater likelihood of recognizing and or discovering what it is that's going on, that what they may want or what they may need, or how they would like things to go or be different or to change. And so that's that kind of tie in some ways about that. But stereotypically, guys, because of guy rules, are socialized to problem solve. We immediately jump into doing something and being an active agent in trying to make something happen. And there's all kinds of benefits to that, but there's a tremendously strong push and training that we get by just being guys in the culture. And that can be problematic. This is one of the ways that normatively guys can have some trouble, because when a problem is presented or when a difficulty occurs, guys who've been socialized in the masculine kind of rules are likely to try and step in and try and make something happen. And so that notion about being able to sit and being able to make the space for the other person becomes really important. But that's not exclusive to guys, because there are plenty of women who also are active and proactive. I'm just saying that normatively, there's a lot of socialization for that. And that's problematic. So it's about kind of paying attention to and keeping an eye on whether you are trying to jump in to help them fix the problem or to resolve it or to feel better, or all of those kinds of pressures that you feel, especially the more you care about the person that you're talking to or who's talking to you.
I guess what I would say about this is we you know, I guess we have free will. We seem to perceive that we do, but we don't have unlimited choices, and many of them are package deals. So if the judge forces me to go to treatment for my alcohol abuse, okay, I may get better because of some things that happen once I'm forced into that situation. I've seen that happen for a lot of people. In a marriage, if you don't let your partner know that something they're doing is a deal breaker, it's liable to be broken anyway. If you let them know it's potentially a deal breaker, at least there is that element of choice. And for many people, that's the start of them changing a relationship, you know, a coupleship for the better. And a lot of people have faced that in the pandemic here, as they, you know, couldn't run away from the fact that they're living with this person, and now those things need to be addressed.
I really like what you're saying, John. What you're saying is that the forced pivot in a marriage is that we are faced with what's happening here and something has to change. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then when the judge says you have to go to treatment, that is a forced pivot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So sometimes those are helpful because that's opening up the communication saying, hey, well, in a marriage situation, hey, this is an issue. But I wonder if that's different in terms of setting your own boundaries, maybe. In terms, and y'all can be like, hold on. But in terms of this is an issue for me, and so I need us to communicate about this, or else I need to go do something different, as opposed to you need to do something different because I want you to. Does that make sense? No.
Sounds complicated.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does,
The
but that,
whole freedom of choice thing. Yeah.
well, it gets kind of entangled in my mind because of it makes sense to me also about the notion that what you're doing is saying this is what I need or this is what I want in a relationship and in a partnership. And you can say, and I need that, and if I can't have it, then I'm going to have to pivot. Okay. But the other person isn't forced into doing that. They have the here's the euphemism. They have the opportunity for a growth experience. They have the opportunity to change or recognize that that's important, but they also may not choose that. That may not be comfortable for them. They may not recognize it or appreciate it or respect it or whatever. And that's similar to the situation even with the judge, because when the judge orders you go to treatment, you cannot go to treatment. Now, then the judge is likely to send somebody to bring you and put you in jail if you don't do that. But there's still, it's more to me about what John was talking about is we have choice, but that doesn't mean we have infinite choice. And so there are places where there are forced outcomes that happen from that. I'm trying to think about, we kind of drifted into almost theoretical notions about the dynamics of free will and choice and setting boundaries with each other about what's more practical in knowing about that. But maybe for me, it could be, or it would be that what we're faced with now is the opportunity and the requirement that we recognize we're about to go back into doing things like we always did. When stuff is just moving along, you can just not be aware of it. You can find yourself down the road. Now fairly commonly used metaphor of putting a frog in a pot of water and slowly turning the heat on, that the frog doesn't end up jumping out because the gradual change is enough that it ends up being deadly to them. Well, when we were going along before the pandemic, it was just kind of, we had traffic and we just put up with 2 hours of traffic because that's what it had always been. And so this also presents the opportunity to say, do I want to go back to that? Now, you always had that choice to do that, but that doesn't mean you always had the thing that raised your awareness that that was something to make a decision about or change or whatever. And that's what we're facing now, is whether we choose to step back into that pattern or whether we want to try and create a different pattern. Some of it hopefully based on what we discovered while we were all locked in our houses and sitting on top of each other.
I'm seeing a lot of take what you like and leave the rest. Some parents that are choosing to work remotely permanently, like they're not going back to the office, and are making those choices because they're finding that they're getting so much time back that they used to be on the road commuting, and they're having opportunities to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with their families. And people that used to do parents that used to do lots and lots of traveling are just saying, I don't want to live like that anymore. So I think there's been a lot of the frog got to jump out of the water and make some choices about, wait a minute, you know, that water's getting kind of hot and I don't think I want to do this.
Right. I'm out of the water and I see it boiling. Do I want to jump back in? Okay.
Right, exactly.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's,
Thank
it's
you.
clinging desperately to the side of the pan and wondering whether it's going to go in or jump off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Earlier, I had mentioned this is kind of, we're kind of pivoting here on this one, but Jim, you brought up something.
I'm going to be really tired of that word by the end of this night.
I know. I'm going to start using the word change. How's that?
Right.
We'll use the word change and shift and growth. What else could be in here? So right now, I'm going to choose the word growth, and we're going to put that with an article actually that was sent to me and that we've actually talked about before. And it was, you had mentioned this one several sessions ago about post-traumatic growth. And I'm going to put this article on our resource page because it's really good. And it gives a picture for those of us who don't always like to read. But in this, it discussed how it talked about different survivors of different traumas and that kind of stuff. And it said that half of survivors of trauma, they start to define themselves and their communities by their strengths. And that those strengths came out of that adversity. Yeah. So when we're talking about not just pandemic, not just COVID, but life, you know, how do we make it, or how does post-traumatic growth happen? Can you talk a little bit more about that concept for us?
The first thought that I had when you're saying that is that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It sounded like you've got, like, you know, half of the people don't get killed, so to speak, by it, and they get stronger. That's a little bit too stark, I think. And there's so many different elements to the itself, about the extent of it and the pervasiveness of it and the comprehensiveness of the events that are traumatic, and sometimes for people who are in circumstances that it's repeated, and so it's multiple traumas across time. So all of those things make a difference. But the idea about that's really compelling to me about post-traumatic growth is that first is just the concept, because we're also familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. We often use that jokingly when we talk about something that's happened. It's of course a serious condition and state that people can get in and because they've experienced stuff. But the point of that is that it focuses on the fact that somebody's been damaged by this, and that happens, but that's kind of the focus of that concept. And the post-traumatic growth is a resiliency notion that it turns out that human beings are remarkably resilient in the face of all kinds of things, and most humans are able to make their way through and out of difficult or traumatic or catastrophic circumstances and find ways to move their life forward, frankly, without the help of therapists. And so there's some natural things that we have, resources that we have in ourselves, and resources that are about within the community around us, or that we either have or find. But there are some things that go along with post-traumatic growth, and they have to do with ways in which you view yourself and the world, and yourself in relationship to the world. And so one of the things about trauma specifically, or very, very disturbing and upsetting things, is that they, almost by definition, make you rethink what you took for granted about how things are, or how people are, or what you could trust, or what you could believe in. And the question that you're faced with, the challenge that you're faced with, is your conclusion going to be, and so I'm a helpless target and have no capacity for being able to influence this, however difficult it may be? Or do you have an orientation toward how am I going to try and get through this, and how am I going to make the best of it, and how am I going to have joy and enjoyable things and relationships and all that kind of those kinds of things. And so optimism, a sense of an appreciation for the things that do exist. So gratitude is one of those things. The notion of for people of faith, it's their faith traditions and it's their spirituality that is a core of that. All of the major religions have as at their core this notion about what it means to your essence of quality as a person, regardless of what's happened to you or how people view you. And so those, and you also have a community that you're tied to directly that is by definition supportive and family-like. And so those, and all of those different qualities are things that actually people can intentionally build and develop. And so gratitude is something you can do by intentional behavior. Optimism is something you can do. There are people who are born more optimistic and more pessimistic, but you can improve that with certain kinds of ways of thinking. There's finding people, communities, and for our purposes, it'd be communities of faith that do that. So there are ways in which you can take the things that happen and begin to look toward crafting a life that is meaningful and is satisfying and is purposeful and focuses on the kinds of things that are most important to you in the kind of life that you want to live.
One thing I would add is that in general, you want to make sure that you're, to promote this growth, facing, what's going on. Now, in doses, what you don't want to do is to just numb it, to just refuse to face it, or to only focus on, blaming other people, and I think it really helps to kind of look through the lens of knowing that on the one hand, growth is possible. Look for examples of people who are growing around this and recognize that, the pain is real. I mean, all of us have hurt over the last year tangibly with things that we've lost, celebrations that were missed, people that are not with us anymore at all. Those things are gone. And yet it's also true that there were things to discover. I didn't know, if you told me that I could go a year without doing all of these things, I didn't know that was even possible. Maybe I'd do okay in solitary confinement. I hope I don't.
I wouldn't. Nope.
No.
Hope I don't find out,
John, is there something you need to tell us about whether you're going to be here next month? What did you do over the pandemic, John?
And I want to mention one other thing in particular, but which is about relating to other people. One of the things that has really the courage of the medical people and the frontline people, and including people doing things as simple as cleaning buildings and stuff. People with the groceries that we've all come to realize that we depend. That's another growth area, a sense that, how this works, how we're all in this together. And when you get all of that stuff where we're in a trance about civilization and strip it away, where we're kind of detoxified, we see that we have choices, about how we live. And that's a really great thing. Even though it's almost feel a pull, like everyone let's rush back to the way it was. No, let's don't, let's think about it.
One of the things that was also in that article, and this kind of gets back to some of the rushing back or not, was that particular article said that some people get irked by the definition of resilience as bouncing back, when really you can't bounce back to what was, because it's a completely different space. So that, when we're redefining normal, or we're defining a new normal, I think that's a lot of what I hear you all talking about. Can I work from home? Do I have to choose this thing? Is this thing working for me? Is it not? And as I guess as we're looking at making changes in our lives that not just related to this, but really, are we going to jump back in the water?
Right.
What are we going to do? And I think I think it's important for us to realize that we don't go back to what was. When you have something, whatever it is, it changes you, it changes events, it changes the things, and you can grow through that to get to a new definition of normal, I guess.
You don't go back, you go forward with a newfound wisdom. And I have found, even with children that have experienced deep grief during this time, and having to, put up with virtual schooling, and you're in school, now you're not in school, now you're in school, now you're not in school, all the flexibility that's been required of them. That, many of the kids that I'm seeing, there's just a different willingness to sit and think things through differently, and not so much autopilot. It's almost interrupted their pattern of you just do it like this. There's a little more flexibility of them understanding life just isn't, it's not a robot, things do change. And so no, you don't go back, you go forward with a different kind of wisdom about you, regardless of your age. Because I'm seeing that with kids, there's a more of a deep thinking thing happening with children that I'm seeing, like a deeper well happening with them. So
I guess the parallel for me with teenagers that I think parallels that, Stacy, is the phrase is, what's the point? It's like, why am I doing this? The interruption of that flow for the kids that were just moving along as things were going along, there wasn't this real pause that then had them look around and see what this does mean to them. And so teenagers are likely to say, what's the point anyway? But there was a qualitative difference about that I found during the pandemic, because it had them question school. It had them question what they're working toward. It had them question about what they really wanted to work toward if they planned on going to college, or if they didn't want to go to college. And those thoughts were kind of smoothed over by just going to the freshman year classes and the sophomore year classes and the junior year classes and the standardized tests and the application to college, especially in Williamson County. That's a pretty universal thing. I mean, it's broadly a goal, but that's not the same as saying, what am I doing this for? And so that break, but that also means that they're in a existential, and maybe for a significant number of kids, even a spiritual kind of conundrum here about, how do I answer that question? That, do I just go back to this, even though I've really started thinking, I'm not sure what's really worth investing in, that kind of stuff. And so that notion of being thoughtful in a way that's questioning stuff, I've seen also from the teenage side of that.
One thing I would add quickly is just that I think a component of this has been, this will sound a little dark, I'm sorry, forgive me, but in some ways kind of our colossal failure in kind of how we managed this initially in terms of cooperation and working together. And now it appears to be coming together, but that period that we've lived through, particularly with young people, has caused them to question. I think some good things will come out of that. We realize that these kind of circumstances like a pandemic are real and they happen, and we need to be prepared for them. And at the same time, and it laid bare some things about racism, for example. And so we're not putting the genie back in the bottle, you know. That information is there, and that can be an impetus for change, for constructive change, for post-traumatic growth for our civilization. You know, I guess the sound would be my hope.
Yeah.
Well, and having kids, two teenagers and a preteen. I mean, these are conversations that we've had. We've had the conversation of what's the point? We've had the conversation of, you know, why is there so much turmoil? Why do people hate each other like they do? We've had the conversations of not everybody's like that. So I think that does create good spaces to have those kinds of conversations of, yeah, things are hard. They just are, but it doesn't mean that they're hopeless. There are places, you know, when my 13-year-old comes to me and he's like, Mom, I don't understand, why do they not like this person because of the color of his skin? I'm like, I don't know, and he's like, but I'm only 13. What can I do? I can't do anything. Nobody will listen to me. And then that opens itself up for a conversation with, well, what can you do? Okay, you're not going to go, you know, do these things over here, but as a 13-year-old in your school, what can you do? What are those changes? So I think that, you know, how do we grow? How do we take anything that is broken, that isn't working right, and find those things that this might change, this might help. And it may not be on a worldwide scale, but it's on that individual thing, individual level. It's how I treat this person. It's being nice to the person who's stocking the groceries. It's saying thank you to the person who is, you know, standing there and putting all of those groceries there while everybody else is taking them down. It's those little things that we do. And I think we have those opportunities to instill hope in our kids, to teach them to be resilient, to show them that, yeah, it's hard, but it's not all terrible. Sorry, I got on a tangent. Next.
Well, it's making me think about the problem of fear, and that it's very well documented about how it turns us as human beings inward, and we start creating in groups and demonizing out groups. That fear does that. We begin to be concerned about resources. We can be concerned about physical safety. Any of the things that do that. And that's one of the things that disruption and chaotic kinds of uncertainty and unpredictability and you know, especially limitations on resources, which oddly we have, like, you know, we have the toilet paper joke from the early days of the pandemic, but that that on the one hand, there was some humor that could be made of that, but on the other hand, people are observing, oh my goodness, we don't even have toilet paper. Okay. And so the way in which that can then generate a sense of that there's a threat and there's a risk, and I need to protect mine and my stuff, becomes problematic. That's one of those other opportunities for viewing this differently.
Well, now we're on to ketchup. So ketchup apparently is flying off shelves.
Ketchup packages.
Anybody needs to know that.
Packages. That's the problem. It's like, I got a great ketchup recipe, which uses tomatoes, and there's a whole thing about that. And so,
good. We'll turn to you for that.
No,
we'll put that on the resource.
That on the site.
It's interesting. You talked about fear, and there was a conversation I had today it was real interesting. It was full of all kinds of things, and it informed about 3 of my pages worth of notes that we're not going to get to tonight. But this one, I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and she was saying that she was talking to a friend and going to invite them over, and they were talking about what this friend was going to be comfortable doing. And it wasn't a fear of being with new people. They hadn't seen each other in, I think, 9 months, 12 months, something like that. It wasn't a fear of being face to face. It wasn't a fear of sharing a meal. It wasn't that. It was the social awkwardness that they were worried about. And the conversation my friend and I were having was that when you normally haven't seen somebody for a while, your conversation starts with, "So what's new?" And we're in a space where, well, nothing's new because, well, we've all been inside, but at the same time, there's a lot that's new. So there's a, do we gloss over those things? Do we kind of get into the deep end with that? It's this awkward kind of phase of how do we have relationships with people? How do we?
I think the question changes from what's new to how are you? And
that's it. Brilliant.
prior to this, we made some assumptions that, some people were struggling and some people were not, and now we know that we are all frail human beings with, challenges and struggles, and the vulnerability that has come from all of this has been really refreshing for me. And so I think the question just changes from a more superficial, what's new, to how are you? And welcoming a true, authentic answer to that question.
Stacy, that is wonderful.
And that's terrifying. And that's terrifying for some people, because that means being more transparent and more open and more real. And that means that somebody could hurt you easier when you do that. And so we're faced with one of those growth opportunities here about, I also think that concept that Stacy was talking about is spot on. And the idea, though, is that when somebody does ask you, how are you? Or when you ask somebody, how are you? That you actually provide the answer about that, as opposed to, oh, I'm fine, things are great. It's been so complicated being in,
because now we know better. You're not fine.
Well, exactly. And that's the opportunity, but it's going to be scary. But it's a risk. It's a thing that's scary, that's worth testing, that's worth stepping a little bit into, because the nature of your revealing more of what's really going on automatically deepens the relationship. It automatically makes the intimacy something more powerful and more sustaining by doing that. And it's been easy. It can be easy to just pass off the casual answers that don't really share what you're going through and what you're actually feeling. So absolutely, Stacy, I think that was brilliant.
One thing I wanted to add, there's one group that's really touched me with their suffering during this period, and that's single people who really do suffer when they're out of practice. And most of us catch up pretty easily, but the stakes are so much higher. And so I've started 2 support groups for single people, one over 35 and one under 35, during this period. And, it's been really rough for that group of people. A lot of people have become depressed. Husbands and wives, in my work with them, a lot of them have come to find out that they were meeting a lot of their needs in other ways with other people. And so they've had to stretch themselves, which is good generally, unless, you have unrealistic expectations, about that. So you have to get creative sometimes. But I think for most people, catching up socially, is a doable thing. You know, we're all going to be a little bit awkward and do some stupid things, you know, when we get back in the swing of things.
I think one of the things when I started working, actually, when I started coming to church here at Brentwood, one of the questions that they would ask on occasion is, how is it with your soul? I mean, there's something about how are you? And but when I have started putting that into specific people that I'm more close with. And that how is it with your soul? I mean, that is that deep. You can't really pass it off with, my soul's fine, thanks.
No, that one's really heavy. I'm like, in how are you?
Back with you on that.
No,
but I'll get back with you on that.
Like I said, it's those kinds of relationships where that kind of question's gonna get it.
All I did was I was a deer in the headlights with that, because I was thinking, if she asked me that, it's like, okay, what am I going to say to this? Like, I'm having trouble trying to just share my emotions, and you're like having me take deep into my soul. Okay, I'm on the emotion part. Okay, that one I can do. That one I can do.
That sounds kind of authoritative in a scary way. It's like, who's asking? Who's asking?
Minister, like, are you going to hell yet or not? Okay, no, wait. Okay, hold it. I just wanted to say I was feeling kind of scared about coming back in public. That's all it was. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Oh man. That's a good Methodist humor right there now.
That was good. That was good Methodist humor. But it is good. It is good stuff.
Very important.
Oh goodness. This has been a really good conversation. I've still got pages left, but we have to be done here in a minute. So we'll get to that next time. I do want to encourage people who are listening or watching. We have Brentwood United Methodist Church has our sermons online, and you can watch past ones. One of the things that Davis, our pastor, talked about this last Sunday on Easter is he talked about being stuck and how it is that we get unstuck. And I just thought that, like, he even used the word pivot. Like, I heard it in the sermon. I was like, yes, that's our word. I didn't yell that in the middle of the sermon because that would have been
although you might have, because you've been inside for a year and you forgot what it's like to be in the congregation.
Oh, that would be that awkward thing. Sorry. But it was a really good sermon on being stuck and how we get unstuck. I didn't think that I should read his sermon while we were on here either. So I'm going to just encourage people to go back and go back and listen to that. If that is something that you're interested in. I mean, he even talked about the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal there for a while and how it had to get unstuck so that it could go sailing again. It was great. I was like, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So I was really excited about that. One thing I want to leave us with was actually a devotional. I'm going to get it. A devotional that I read back on April 4th. And I actually think that was Easter. And this one is You Are the Beloved by Henry Nouwen, because he's awesome. And this is what it is. The Many Rays of Hope. It says the Easter season is a time of hope. There still is fear. There still is painful awareness of sinfulness, but there also is light breaking through. Something new is happening, something that goes beyond the changing mood of our life. We can be joyful or sad, optimistic or pessimistic, tranquil or angry, but the solid stream of God's presence moves deeper than the small waves of our minds and hearts. Easter brings the awareness that God is present, even when his presence is not directly noticed. Easter brings the good news that although things seem to get worse in the world, the evil one has already been overcome. Easter allows us to affirm that although God seems very distant, and although we remain preoccupied with many little things, our Lord walks with us on the road and keeps explaining the scriptures to us. Thus, there are many rays of hope casting their light on our way through life. So I just wanted to leave everybody with that tonight. We're glad that y'all joined us. We hope you join us again next week, next month, where we'll go through the rest of my notes.
Awesome.
Thank y'all for being here. Thank you to the counselors. Y'all have given us some wonderful stuff to think about. So thank y'all.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
All right.